Ukraine or
Okay.
also.
We are online. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I will tell you more later.
Are we online? Okay. I don't see it yet. Okay.
Yes, we are online.
Great. Yeah. So, thank you. We have a really wonderful guest today again, and I'd like to introduce you the guest. The guest Alevtina Kahidze. She's from Ukraine, and Zal Andronikashvili. He's from Georgia, and he's based now in Berlin. I'm Anna Ryaboshenko. Within this webinar, I represent Culture for Democracy, and we will talk about the propaganda tools and how this Russian propaganda affects not only the culture field, but also affects our a daily life, and what we can do against this, what are the fields and the subjects of the propaganda. So basically, I'd like you to start introducing yourself. Maybe Alevtina, you can start, and then Zal, and then we will go straight to the questions.
Hello. Yes, I'm from Ukraine. I'm based in Ukraine. I never left Ukraine, only for the some exhibitions. Yeah, now I'm also a director of Kyiv State Lyceum, named after Shevchenko, our national hero. Yeah, this is my story. But before I became an educator, all my life was related to the visual art, and unfortunately, 12 years of mine was dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war. Since the war started in Ukraine, I will remind for everyone, it was the date when Crimea started to be occupied. It's February 2014. Then in my city called Zdanivka in Donetsk Oblast was occupied in April 2014. I was all the time in contact with my mom, who decided to stay under occupation until she just died on the checkpoint between controlled territory of Ukraine and non-controlled territory of Ukraine. It happened 16th of January 2019. It means something like 5 years she did live under occupation, and all the time she was there. I phoned her every day, sometimes a few times a day, and everything she saw, she told me, and I invented a Facebook page, then it became a book, then it was a play, then it was the animation film. Everything she told me, what she could see, could notice from her perspective, I put in really long project, which was with not her own name. I invented a name for her. It was Strawberry Andreevna, the story from the occupied Donbass. And yeah, it was really like when I added the last story or moment that she died just on the occupied territory from the site of the checkpoint, traveling to the territory controlled by Ukraine. Some people didn't believe that it happened to my mom because they thought that I invented this bombastic end of the whole story on Klubnika Andreevna, Strawberry Andreevna. So, and what is interesting that I learned from her how war started in Donbass, never visited Donbass. I heard how she explained what is artillery sound, how she hid it in a cellar. I tried to help her with practical advices, which I did read somewhere in internet. Basically, I had theory, what is Russian-Ukrainian war. And let's say in 2022, the story happened just to me, and I became a practitioner. So I didn't start to leave my village in Kyiv Oblast, and Russian tanks, they were stopped near my studio, something like 3 or 5 kilometers. So it's a Bucha region, if you know what Bucha is. So we are one Kazlograd, like between us, really, like if just go through the fields, I don't know, you can walk to the uh, small city which called Bucha. So I did survived and was a victim of these, let's say, 40 days when Kiev Oblast was occupied and then was liberated by Ukrainian armed forces. So it's a long story, but my background is like this. And so since I survived, all people in village were not better, not worse, but just we were lucky that they didn't come to us. Yeah, it's brought me a lot of feelings, and since the time I just do draw everything I see around. I do talk about Russian in general. Mainly, I thought what is Russian culture is. I stopped speak Russian. Just yeah, yes. Before I did. So this my background. I hope it's already enough.
Thank you, Aleftina. Yeah, it's definitely a really powerful story because while telling you background, it's how the history actually creates us and changes us, and it's very important for the others to know. And thank you for this. Sal, could you please introduce yourself? And while we are starting with the subject, maybe we will already touch the subject of the propaganda, and after introducing, you can open up the discussion on whether the history is one of the crucial some main subjects where the propaganda touches and why, how they're trying to affect to rewrite the history. Thank you, Zal, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this talk, and I'm very glad to meet Aleftina here. I am scholar of literature and culture. I work in Berlin in the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research, and I'm also a professor at the Ilia State University in Georgia. So I'm based in both countries, both towns, and both institutions. And I'm working mainly, I have two directions of work, and one of them has a lot to do with narratives, or narrative theory. And the second one is is cultural history of Georgia in a very broad context of Black Caucasus, Black Sea, and Russian imperial history, Soviet history, and post-Soviet history. So if we combine these two things together, then we have the topic of our today's meeting, the role of historical narratives. And this is something which is very important for Russian propaganda and also for our understanding in Ukraine, in Georgia, but also in Germany and the European Union in general, because Russia is weaponizing history. And this weaponizing of history started not with Putin. This is a large tradition, large Soviet tradition, actually starting with Stalin, who was one of the most important figures for the rewriting of history of all of the of Russia, and but also of Russia's subjects in the Soviet Union, like Georgia and like Ukraine and like many other countries as well, investing his figure not only into the present but also to the past. So we're basically, when we're in Georgia, still learning history in the frame of the narrative which was produced in Stalin's time. Maybe I will come back to this a little bit later, because we are speaking now about narratives of Putin's Russia, which are indeed very powerful. I give you a recent example of such a narrative or such a historical framing, which affects directly the politics of European Union towards Ukraine and towards Russia. Spiegel is one of the most important German newspaper, not newspapers, but magazines. One of the most respected one, and it came this week with the cover, Unser Krieg gegen Russland, our war against Russia, meaning actually the war against the Soviet Union. And this equating of the Soviet Union with Russia is one of the most important tools for Russian propaganda, victimizing itself as a victim of German aggression 1941, and also making Ukraine and Belarus two countries which absorbed the most terrible parts of the German occupation, so writing them out of the history practice and making them practically and making them vanish from this history. And this is something which affects German politics because Russians are always pressing on this German guilt and saying, okay, you attacked us, you were aggressors in this war, and now you are repeating the same with the hands of the Ukrainians, right? And this is something which you constantly see in lots of in this messaging of the social media, Twitter or X
Yeah,
now,
however,
and so on.
I'm sorry. However, the European Union countries, most of them, they've acknowledged that the Russia was an aggressor as well within the country. And
It's not the
is
matter
it?
they acknowledge because it's on on different levels. Of course, and people like on this government level acknowledge this. But what I want to say is that this cover of Spiegel shows how deep this narrative is still sitting there, in the heads of common German newspaper reader or magazine reader, because in these years after the Russian full-scale annexation in 2022, and as Aleftina has absolutely rightly said, from the moment of the annexation of Crimea in 2000 in the February 2016 when the World War actually started, lots of work has been done by the historians of Eastern Europe, in Germany, in Europe, to change this perception radically, but it is still here. So this is just maybe one example of this framing of the historical narrative. If I have time, I can give you another example as well, affecting also Georgia more and other countries. Right. Another example is this myth of the peaceful defragmentation of the Soviet Union, which is absolutely not true because the Soviet Union. So there were different conflicts starting from war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, with wars in South Ossetia, in Abkhazia, in Chechnya, and so on, right? So it was a very violent dissolution of the Soviet Union, but it was also always framed as a kind of ethnic conflicts in Georgia or in Moldavia and Transnistria, but not in case of Russia. So Russian-Chechenian war was not staged as ethnic conflict. Ethnic conflicts were only between, others, but Russia was not involved in ethnic
So it's
conflicts.
basically
This
the
is
Russia is trying to sell it. For instance, the Chechnya is kind of like we are basically fighting for the rights of the people on this.
Yes, or
Yeah, it's kind of an
fighting
image.
against terrorism or restoring the constitutional order in
And it's
Chechnya,
our
whatever.
own
But
territory. So on
yeah,
the own territory, whether the other conflicts, they always present themselves as a peacemakers.
or these other conflicts are ethnic conflicts between, for example, Georgians and Abkhaz, right? Or Georgians and Ossetians. And this is also a part of this, well, ideological framing or narrative framing, which is an absolutely wrong one because you can or you should frame all these conflicts as parts of this dissolution of the Soviet Union and parts of the war, which is ongoing now with the most brutal war, the Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So these wars are going on practically from the moment or even before the moment of the dissolution of Soviet Union. So this is another powerful narrative, which also frames everybody outside of Russia, Georgians, Ukrainians, as nationalists who are violently fighting against their minorities, while Russia is presented like an international or not nationalist power. So these are maybe two very important examples which are still in the mindset of in Europe as well, and which are still very much exploited by the Russians and their proxies.
Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you, Gal. Yeah, that was a really nice, quite interesting thing you mentioned that Russia always presents everyone as a nationalists and fighters towards against the Russian empire, but the Russians themselves being the nationalists against the all other nations. Aleftina, could you give us the example of you started talking about this occupied territory and the first war that you getting this information from your mom while she's been there until her death on the occupied territory? It would be very hard for you, I can imagine. But then, what was the propaganda and how the actually Russian propaganda is outreaching these occupied territories in Ukraine? And maybe also to touch a little bit, how does it affect the against Ukraine propaganda in reference to what Zal said already? Thank you.
I'm so happy that I do have this document from 2014 until 2019. We did talk because I mean, the Ukrainians are still not there. And if Donbass would be back, my text as well as other materials were produced from the art perspective, literature perspective, plus journalism, of course, and different investigations or research or for instance, can you hear? We have alert, guys. I have to go to bomb shelter, but I will be with you. Ukrainians stop really like do all
Well,
the
if you
time
if
today.
you
No, no,
need
no,
to go
no.
to the bomb shelter, we don't want really to
No, no, no.
keep you with us.
Ukrainians already banned sometimes to react on this. Otherwise, all our life would be really like paralyzed. Anyway, so from 2014 when my mom started to explain me what is happening around here, and she didn't say Aleftina, the myth number one, Russian propaganda, or myth number two, Russian propaganda. No, she was just saying me, Aleftina, why all the people on the market saying that the war was started because the Maidan? I said, Mom, so of course it's connected, but it's not the reason that Russia started Russian-Ukrainian war against. No, the protest is really internal situation of sovereign state. So this one myth. So they immediately started to claim that the decision of Ukrainians decide by themselves what is their path to be in future, which was Maidan in 2013, 2014. If everyone is now know, it's started 20 of November and finished basically until Yanukovych left the country, 20 of February 2014. So, and this number one, that all Russian-Ukrainian war started because Ukrainian went to the square. That's number one. Myth number two, that Kiev government, as was said in all this Russian propaganda, will not allow anyone speak Russian, even in houses, even in private circles. Till now, guys, you can come to Kiev and go through the city, be in pubs, you will hear Russian language till now. But in 2014, it was said that it would be absolutely dangerous. So, myth number two. Then there were very funny myths. For instance, about this сланцевий газ. Зараз я перекладу. In America, there are a lot of this. Who can help me?
The
Oh my God. So this is the gas, very
yeah.
much popular in the US. Uh, oh my God. So this particular gas, which actually till now in Ukraine, we don't have in production, but there was the time that Americans were really interested if it
Shale
would be
gas.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, would be interested to really do development in Sloviansk because we have a lot of maybe possibilities, and at the moment no one knows because it still was just under research process. My mom told me that people in market were saying that Kiev will use this type of gas to damage all the people living in Donbass. It's absolutely crazy because till now we don't have this production. I can just go more and more and more. For instance, very interesting. Also, this area, Donbass, in mining factory area, and people in that time when there was the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war, they received 10% less their salary, 10%, and it was said that this 10% their salary was taken because Ukrainian armed forces needed money for the ammunition. And it's also happened because I would say political party called Regiony. So they were absolutely affiliated with Russian Federation. So it also was kind of a spec operation how to manipulate by, let's say, simple miners in Donbass. So just mentioned four myths for you. If it's not enough, just give me a sign.
Well, thank you, Aleftina. I guess it really shows exactly how this works. The also kind of important thing is how these people are actually vulnerable toward this propaganda. What are the tools there are some ridiculous things that it's hard to believe on a daily basis and suddenly become realistic, and suddenly people start to believe this, which is a matter of the propaganda, and probably this is the way how they're trying to affect. I would also ask you how the Russia actually uses these international platforms against the Ukraine, and since we are more or less connected to the culture field, all the people of the representatives are talking here. It's pretty much, sometimes we don't really acknowledge that these cultural big platforms are actually political platforms, and the way how this propaganda is using it. For instance, in the Georgian case, so we know now we have the Russian proxy government in the country. They are spending enormous amount of money to be presented on the international platforms and to show that everything is perfect and we're not sanctioned and everything is great here. So what are the main things that you can probably mention, like how the Russian propaganda is fighting the Ukrainians on the international platforms? The Venice Biennial is probably the case. There are plenty of so-called Italian foundations that are actually the Russian foundations back up on the different countries and not only Italy, that are supporting the exhibitions. If you remember, there was this exhibition after Mariupol that was focused on the exhibition 10 years of war in Donbass, actually. The Vento del East Foundation organized this, if you remember this case, and so on and so on. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how these things are done there, and then I'll ask Saul also to jump on his own examples and tell us a little bit from his perspective how he already started it on the German example and the Spiegel example, but we can also touch some other parts if you feel like it's relevant. Thank you.
Anyway, I will start from the 2014 meeting curators. Basically, I will not say the name, but Anna, you know this curator. This woman was very important figure for Georgia, by the way. I remember when I met her in St. Petersburg. It was 2014 Manifesta 10. I even took part. I remember she was absolutely furious. She was saying, "What you're doing in Ukraine? You don't allow people speak their own language, Russian." She was just screaming to me. I was absolutely shocked. I remember that my answer to her was, "Listen to me. I grew up in family where my grandma, mother of my mom, spoke only Ukrainian. But my mom, living with her all her life, left my little city, Zdanivka, just to go to Odessa because she wanted better life. Spent like 3 years only and back again to her own house where my grandma, so they just left all their life together, except the 3 years being in Odessa, where, by the way, she met my father, Tamazi Kahidze, who went to study marine art. He became a marine in Odessa, so he chose this city. So they met, fell in love, and I appeared, by the way, in May there. So I mentioned this creator that my mom never spoke Ukrainian. I asked her, dear, what happened if two people left together, mother and daughter, don't speak the same language? Are you going to talk to me? What is the wish of Donbas people to speak their own language? Me as well didn't speak Ukrainian, but my grandmom did. Of course, it happened because something was between my mom and my grandma. My mom, of course, even didn't remember the year when she switched into Russian. She was just simple woman. For social lifting, she started to speak Russian. But since my grandma was just a person without a job at that moment, when I remember all my life with her, I just phonetically took all this pronunciation, really the way to speak. So I just gave this example how to bring this just one person, the creator who has absolutely power in Berlin. Zal, she does work in Berlin. And I just was saying, hey, you just don't know the background about present of Ukrainian language in Donbass. Another story, guys. Why my family appeared in Donbass? They were living in Vinnytsia, central of Ukraine, where were just Ukrainian speaking people. Two kids in 32 when there was Holodomor, artificial hunger, they just lost two kids. My grandfather said, we have to run from here. They went to Donbass, where there were many people from different places. They all spoke Russian. But my family went from Vinnytsia, where everyone spoke Ukrainian. I could imagine how hard it was for them. And they were not alone. They just secured their life. Maybe only because they decided to do this long pass, I appeared. And this is the background for me. Don't speak Ukrainian at that time when I met this curator. And then she said, why you don't speak Ukrainian? Okay, guys, listen. Since I'm a director of State Art Lyceum, I had to pass exam. What is the level of my Ukrainian? This is the rules now for all people who have state positions. So this girl till now works in Berlin. When I met her in 2015, I always like to talk about a story. You know, Zal, I don't write text. I don't know how to put all this important information and theory. I just feel by the stories. I'm artist, I'm practicer. So then I met this woman again. I thought just she could spend time to educate herself or just remember what the witness told her. I was describing her what I actually experienced when Russian tanks were not so far from my village in 2022. We didn't have water because our electric line was damaged. It means you can't poo in your own house. You have to make a hole in your garden and all your dogs looking what you're doing. You just follow us. Eventually, we're on the same level. You know, this is the story about just being without the things we call civilization. So I was telling her very brightly everything, how we are all neighbors trying like to survive, how I just worried about aquarium fish and they died because again they needed accident. No, okay, a lot of stories. I was telling like it to a friend. And you know what this woman told me? She just said, Aleftina, but still, the worst empire is the US. So what I see in Berlin. So what the Russian do in Ukraine. So it's never in repetitive way what
Terrible.
is the US. Then I answered her, yeah, you know, girl, I'm expert on Russia. If you just bring me the people who are really colonized or really like know what is American aggression, I will discuss with them who is the worse. So this was my debate, let's say. So I would say, let's say, First World, they do know a lot about French colonization of a lot of countries, Dutch, you know, Brits, of course, Belgium, Americans, but unfortunately, no knowledge. Yeah, Zal, you just mentioned that so many produce, but not enough, probably. Or I don't know, just you, the person who can just explain why it's like this. So then, if just to uh, talk closer to the Venice situation, I was in Venice 2004. I was very skinny. I lost 8 kilograms after this Kiev area occupation for 40 days and then liberated, hopefully. So I was debating on the round table which Ukrainian Institute organized and talk besides to Sergei Plakhy, you know, the one of the most successful or known historian, Sergei Plakhy, who does teach, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, right? So, and at that time, of course, it was absolutely like, oh my God, it was still hard to talk what happened to Ukraine, that it was the second chapter of Russian-Ukrainian war. Because even remember before 2018, I had an exhibition in Belgium, and the man from the institute and his discipline was how we deal with errors. It was like his discipline, or I don't know, chair named. He said, what is your civil war in Ukraine? So this is his interpretation of the first chapter of Russian-Ukrainian war. So this is the context. And just in 2024, I was again in Venice. I was debating besides to Minister of Culture of Ukraine, Minister of Culture of Poland also was, Lithuania, Moldova, Latvia, and Estonia. They all were giving speeches against that Russian pavilion was presented at Venice. So they prepared speech. They made this coalition. So I was near. Then, let's say 20 minutes later, there was this Pussy Riot protest, which for Ukrainians, like, so I don't want to occupy a lot of time. So we are pretty skeptical. Some people are not. It's process. Then there was to protest more. Polish colleagues also standing in front of the Russian Venice, and then there was action of Ukrainian military in former life. He's amazing operator. Now he's in Ukrainian Armed Forces in investigation office. So he was in his uniform, the black one, all these chevrons that it's Ukraine, and he was just this notebook, and it was written to list all the people who presented in Russian pavilion, and like, so he was amazingly confident. His uniform was beautiful. He behaved like he knows what he does. Very calmly was writing something in the notebook. So, and of course, all these chevrons and Ukrainian the different symbols of state Ukrainian officers was on his uniform. And I also went in this pavilion, and I remember the friend of mine from Estonia, Alevtina, why you went to this Russian pavilion? Why you stepped there? I said, It's our pavilion. Actually, Ukrainian businessman, Ukraine at the time, Ukraine was not really a state. So in 19th century, very successful businessman from Kiev. His name is Hanenko-Tereshchenko family. They built this pavilion. But it was Russian Empire. So Ukrainians behaved like they at home. Of course, we all know that the investigation and the participation for presentation of Russian Empire at the time at Venice was done by Ukrainian mecenat.
Thank you, Aleftina. That's pretty interesting. There were some examples. So basically, you were saying that the understanding of colonialism coming from the firstly Russian Empire and followed by the Soviet, if we call this, can call this a colonialism, it's not there. It's not there. Where while we are talking about the empires like the UK, or we're talking British Empire, we're talking about the state, American empires, and so on. But that the Russia is still not presented as the colonial state, as an occupant on West. And the other thing that, if I'm correct, that you mentioned that there are still creative ways to attract and point the side in the right direction, because we can somehow affect the public opinion, even though these things might seem very naive at some point, but on another hand, they still have a power. And while we have like one thing presented there, we're always capable of opposing it, which was very sad. I'd like to say that the Georgians being presented there, despite there was a big discussion about the Georgian pavilion again, as always, because whether we are not, most of the artists here, as maybe you know, are in a boycott. They don't cooperate with the state institutions, and of course being presented in a national pavilion means you have to cooperate with the state institutions. However, they could have joined this the movement. That was a quite significant processes that took place at the Venice Biennial, when the curators stepped down, when there was the most of the artists, they said no to the to participation in the selection and so on. They, at least there could have been some statement from individuals, but we have not seen anything like that, even the creative performance of anything or anything else. But yeah, there are like two subjects. Al, what do you think? How can you refer to this concept of the Russia as a colonial state? And you started a little bit mentioning that the understanding whether the Russia stands these days is still not deep enough.
Well,
It was
thank you very
stated.
much, and thank you, Alestina, for this very moving story. Maybe I will start there when you finished. Because Russia is weaponizing not only historical narratives, but it's also weaponizing its sports and culture. And that's what happens in Venice Biennale this year, where let's call him the general of the Russian culture, Shvydkoy, was present. He was also present in Georgia now, bringing some Russian plays in the Rustaveli Theater and showing this cultural presence of Russia. And this is a part of a hybrid war. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with culture, but it has to do with this Russian hybrid warfare. And it is important to understand how culture as weapon functions, because it's something that people like Shvydkoy or many of supporters of Putin's Russia are telling. So the culture is, outside of the politics, and let's go and hear to Netrebko or whoever, or Gergiev, or whoever supports Russian war with Ukraine. So this is something, this is art, and art unites, and so on, which is not really true, because, and let's start to understand what is happening there, right? So Aleftina has been in Venice. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to do it yet. but Alevtina knows maybe better as me. So they have their like this tree which is hanging there, and they also quote Pushkin and so on, right? Simultaneously with Venice, an exhibition opened in St. Petersburg in Manezh, which was called Ruski Imperativ, Russian Imperative. And it had this fascistoid face of the Russian soldier, right? And this Russian imperative means, very different thing, or shows very different face than Russia shows in Venice. So it shows this propaganda machine of, fighting for our fatherland and fighting with Europe and so on and so on. So it shows the real face of what is going on, right? And if you put these two faces together, you become kind of amalgam of what actually the real Venice Pavilion is. So it is a part of Russian war and a part of Russian propaganda. And Russian imperative is not the same as Kant's categorical imperative. It means basically the unconditional support to Putin's politics. And we have also a very longue durée of this imperial science. So Russia is turning its culture to weapons, right? And Russia does so to Tolstoy, to Dostoevsky, to Pushkin, and to whatever it is. I will give you a very interesting example for Georgia. Now, to this Russian section, we don't have an embassy in Georgia of Russia. We have a section in the Swiss embassy, which represents Russian interests after the Russian war in Georgia 2008, and they become very active now. And so they celebrated something. I think they celebrated Pushkin's birthday.
They celebrated the Day of
Where
Russian Language.
or the Day of Russian Language, right? And they stood at the Pushkin Monument in Georgia, which is a very interesting thing. It is a second monument of Pushkin, the Russian Empire, and it has a very interesting story which shows exactly how Russia is weaponizing culture, right? And how where this tradition starts and where this tradition or how this tradition continues. Because Pushkin was not at the best terms with the Russian Tsar family, as you are aware of, but they understood and started that Pushkin is a kind of cultural asset and started to appropriate him in the end of the 19th century already and beginning of the 20th century. So the monument in Tbilisi was commissioned by different people, so private people paid for this, and one of them was the chief of police of Tbilisi. Who wanted that Pushkin's monument looks absolutely identical or in the same shape as Alexander I's monument made by Thorwaldsen. Thorwaldsen was one of the most famous sculptures of that time, right? The interesting thing was that Pushkin hated absolutely Alexander I, and he also hated especially this monument made by Thorwaldsen, and for him this was a sign of the this imperial lies and imperial hypocrisy. So, but when he stood in Tbilisi, he already became also a monument of Alexander I and the monument of empire, right? So this is a very interesting moment where where something shifts. And the person of culture, representative of culture, who may not support imperial politics at all, which Pushkin did in some cases when he wrote his poem about Polish uprising. He was turned to a sign of empire, and then when you see that such monuments in Ukraine are now put away, for example, Bulgakov and Pushkin and so on. Most of the people in Europe complain and say you're fighting culture. No, they're fighting imperial signs, but these signs are weaponized or turned to the weapons not by Ukrainians, but by Russians. But for an average observer in Europe, it looks like, we're fighting culture and canceling culture and so on. And to show this mechanism and to show how it works and how really Pushkin can be turned into Putin, is this very important thing to understand how is Russia dealing with its own culture and how it's turning Pushkin or Tolstoy to another Oreshnik. to use it as a weapon in this war.
Yeah, Alexina, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I would say that Ukrainians, after 3 years, maybe 2 years from 2022, understood that they are a bit mistaken. They had not to say cancel Russian culture, we had to say ban Russian culture. I am very ironically say, let's all the Russian intellectuals take sabbaticum. You know the sabbaticum. They have to think what is happening to their own culture. So Ukrainians ban Russian literature, Russian culture, Russian ballad, Russian art, whatever, because we don't see how Russian intellectuals demonstrate the really very precise look how it's possible, what is the connection between this Russian-Ukrainian war and unworked and very badly done homework. What it was, what is the connection between Pushkin and many people in Russia, they are still chauvinistic. And Pushkin was chauvinist. He was chauvinist. And the funny story, maybe hello to the Swiss embassy, maybe they don't know, the people who work there, that why Pushkin appeared in Kafkas. It was not friendship with Alexander first, but then they became friends because probably Pushkin made his own choice not to be against government in Russia at that moment. But I don't know, sometimes when all the people who like to protect Russian literature, for instance, I really produce so many very funny tests. I ask them how many people were killed in novel by Dostoevsky, «Преступление, наказание», punishment and crime,
Right.
or crime and punishment, doesn't matter. So I ask people how many, and very little number of people say two. They don't know what they are actually defending. I do know Russian literature so much. I haven't had any other literature being in school. And then the question is, we have this very precise heart, as we are Ukrainians. You also, if you remember in Lermontov, the Sorim Siri, but this is like each page you do read, you understand. This is such a colonial essay. Of course, no one will make this homework, not explain what we feel when we read novels related to Ukraine context, Georgian context. Unfortunately, I met very late people abroad who really discovered all this story. And when you start to show all these sentences, what is here written, the problems of translation really high. So I would say we sometimes Ukrainians feel that we just undermine centimeters of this misunderstanding. What is Pushkin novels? What is Lermontov novels? Dostoevsky. Okay, we also have very interesting Chekhov, who was partly Ukrainian, and he was from Slobozhanщина. And then the question, this very funny novel written by him, Человек в футляре, it's probably Body in the Box. So he's describing of two Ukrainians appeared in Deep Russia. But why they appeared in Deep Russia? Because it was banned for Ukrainian language, and those people appeared there. All the people I met, they loved Chekhov plays. They said, have you seen this play? Yes, of course I seen, but they don't understand why these two Ukrainians appeared in Deep Russia. So Chekhov wrote this. Like it was a sentence, oh, it's so как это, lonely and not really married to be in this deep Russia. I really miss Ukraine. Українською це буде звучати. Хочу хохлят вчити. I really like to actually teach Ukrainian kids. But why he couldn't teach Ukrainian kids? Because it was the situation after Emsk, if you know Emsk ban law, when
Mhm.
what Russians did in the time, they took teachers, Ukrainian teachers, but not of state schools. Ukrainians very smart. Why we actually still have our language? Because it was like volunteers art schools, where in villages people can really bring their kids where they could speak Ukrainians there. So they started to take all these teachers and send them to deep Russia. And this is two characters in this novel. I explain this in, by the way, in Zurich in the performance and was successful. Many people really were coming, yeah, now we understand what is actually in this Chekhov novel. But the question is, the people from other context, they sometimes, maybe it's still okay, they cannot understand this is slight context details, which is brightly illustrate that this is actually about colonization of Ukraine. Started, we all know from where it started in 1654, when Bogdan Khmelnytsky signed agreement with Russia. And since the time, we are colonized by this country. So inside of Ukraine, we have a lot of young researchers who produce books in Ukrainian Institute. You can go to the website. You can see the link where all the new essays, articles, text about decolonization. And sometimes we have this kind of situation. Oh my God, not more time to say decolonization. Now we even have anecdotes about decolonization in Ukraine, but we still probably not successfully enough that everyone in the EU, everyone in the US and in other countries start to use this verticalization of Ukraine because of Russia. I don't know. Recently, I was in Japan. There is easy because we are like, sometimes we are the first who tell the story. In this situation, when Russians were very fast to tell their story, unfortunately, doesn't work to retell our own way to look at the situation.
So what we are saying, it's in other words, it's not fighting the culture itself or the art of certain culture, but try to help to understand what it is about. There is not there is not a contradiction of being a good writer, but also working for propaganda or working for the certain states and their interests. Maybe this is also like why particularly these regimes are also trying to control the institutions, the culture institutions, and also to promote it somehow. Yeah, it's a very interesting subject, and I guess it's very understandable, unfortunately, for both our countries, unfortunately, I'd say. But it also shows that we have a lot of things to do still ahead, and in order to somehow to make the other people who've been isolated and also um saw us as a part of Soviet Union only, the past, which is equal in most cases as a part of Russia, not an independent state and not an independent countries. This is the kind of a fight for our own identities, in fact, and prove the rest of the world that we're different actually, and whatever is written about us in this so-called like great literature or whatever is described on us and these cultural products is not exactly the same what we are really representing it. And unfortunately, for me, it also affects the societies within these countries where we've been victimized. We are also victims on this. And on this last topic, I would also like to ask you, Zal, on this recent example, as you mentioned, you're also working in Ilia State University here. in Georgia, which is probably known as one of the free islands of the freedom left, one of the last free islands left in this country. Why particularly the proxy regime is trying to fight it and to put a state control over this institution. And maybe after this, we will just give a final remarks on what you would like to say and share what we have not touched during our discussion, and that will be all for now. Zal.
Well, the regime of Georgian Dream or regime of Ivanishvili is trying to, or it's basically closing the most successful university in Georgia and beyond, also in the region, because it doesn't has any control. So they want to control every sphere, the sphere of culture, the sphere of education as well, and it already controls the Javakashvili State University, which is the older one. And now, because it cannot control Ilia State University, they want to strangle it and almost closing it without closing it, right? And education is very important because it produces, free thinking and introduces thinking at all. So it's the institution which, or one of the major institutions which basically stood at the beginning of what we call now, democracy and free speech and so on. This medieval inventions or post-medieval inventions, which were quite unique and quite different from other educational institutions of medieval times, right? So the university itself is a symbol of freedom and a symbol of autonomy and a symbol of democracy. And that's why this attack on the universities represents in a nutshell what Georgian Dream is trying to do, to kill everything which is uncontrollable or free or autonomous, right? This is also something which Russia does and which tries to undermine it on very different scales and levels. Yeah.
From my
Yeah.
side, I'm very inspired that Anna organized this meeting. We really have to work together. I wish Georgia still fight for democracy. I wish my country be as we are. You know what we are doing as all our art, literature, other culture actors, they say Ukrainian armed forces do the best decolonization. So we can't really do better than they. So many also my friends from the cultural sphere are there. So let's stay together. And it's amazing. I always wanted, just didn't have time. More than Anna, I just feel that we have to be more and more close. And Georgians and Ukrainians are the best advisors to tell what Russia is.
And how to fight these hypocrites.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. It's actually been quite significant for me as well to talk to you both, because I remember a couple of years ago, we've been talking about these online seminars and discussions. And basically, I was talking to both of you, separately to Zal and separately to Alexina, that we're going to have this series of discussion mentioning the decolonization concept and also how important it is to share with ourselves, first of all, to share what we experience, to better understand where we stand and what our powers we actually have. And also very much important what Zal started with, actually, like how the West, what is the perception of the West towards our nation and towards the Russia itself, but it would also help us to find out what is our real identity and how we can fight. What do we have enough power tools to fight this? Sal, would you like to? So I'm really happy to have you both here, and I'm totally agree that this is very much important that we have to continue on, and we have a lot of work ahead. We very much hope we're looking forward to everything what's happening in Ukraine. It touches us very personally, and every success that Ukrainian armed forces are getting,
Mm.
it's our success. That's not a question. Like this is like every time whatever is happening there, the social media in Georgia is just booming because like we take it very personally, and I guess it's understandable. So Zawal, I would like you to say also a couple of words and
Well, thank you very much, and I very much agree with Aleftina that this is something that we can do together. So it's necessary to make joint efforts between Georgia and Ukraine and Armenia. Maybe it has something to do which Aleftina or you addressed as decolonization, which has become a word which is now, as Aleftina said, a little bit ridiculed as well. I would like hear one of these anecdotes, but I was now, before we started to talk, working on a talk about Merab Mamardashvili, who is also using a strange thing, which of course has not, he doesn't call it decolonization, but which has to do with thinking of the history on understanding, which is more important, the historical experience. And he's speaking. He has two very interesting terms, and one of the terms is in Russian sceplение, kind of linking, and another one is расцепление, which is delinking. So the historical process, he thinks the historical process, to put it very briefly, as linking of certain things, ideas, and so on, which then structure the field of history. So, if something happens, like for example universities or like certain institutions, then that shape kind of development of societies in a way in which other societies, and these things not happened, are shaped in another way. And so he says about Russia then, because in Russia there were not this mechanisms of law to shape certain conflicts among society, and in place of that there was this formula of самодержавие, православие, народность. Every dissent against the government became kind of treason of Russia, right? So these things that shape very big historical or geographical spaces, and he says that delinking of these experiences are also possible, but you cannot just delink, just detach them. So in order to delink, you have to link it to something different, right? And his example, very interesting example he has, was kind of delinking and linking of the German-French experience, which was the basis of the European Union after the war, right? This this union of mountaineers and so on. So what in our case, in case of Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova and Armenia and so on, we have to not just to detach ourselves from Russia, but to create these new linkages, to start basically a new experience, new geographical region, which binds us and our experiences together, which are already very close. So this is something that I think is maybe our version of what we can call or be similar to what, in Latin America was called decolonization. A work which is, I think, necessary for all of us, and which is already started, but which has to continue.
Thank you, Zal. Thank you, Alexina, and I hope the people who attended and listened to us and will listen later on this because it will be published as the Reels. They will also find it interesting and inspiring because indeed in this shift of power and shift of changes in the global world these days, we also have to find our rightful place there. And I'm pretty sure that Ukraine already did, and it's a kind of essential and powerful place in these new realities. And we will also try to catch up with this. So thank you all, and it was absolute
Thank you.
pleasure. talking to you, and I hope to see you soon. Thank
Thank
you.
you.